The first spadeful of earth was a promise and a betrayal. It broke the green skin of the hill, exposing the dark, cold soil beneath. Elias Thorne, all of 19 years and carrying the weight of 3 funerals, drove the blade in again. The steel rang against a hidden stone. He adjusted his angle and continued. His only companion, a scruffy dog of indeterminate heritage named Boro, sat a few feet away, head cocked, intelligent brown eyes tracking the methodical labor. Boro offered no judgment, only a patient, grounding presence. The air was cool for late spring, carrying a damp scent of pine and thawing ground from the peaks that loomed over their small valley town of Prospects Fall. The town lay exposed on the valley floor, a tidy grid of wooden houses and storefronts that looked brave in summer and fragile the rest of the year. Elias had chosen his spot with a care that bordered on obsession. The north-facing slope of a steep hill, a place no sensible farmer would terrace and no builder would clear. It received the least sun, held the snow the longest, and was perpetually in the shadow of the ridge above. He worked for 3 days, carving a precise rectangle into the hillside before he received his first visitor. Mr. Abernathy reined in his horse at the edge of the churned-up earth, his weathered face a mask of disbelief. He was their closest neighbor, a man whose 40 years in the valley had etched deep lines of pragmatic skepticism around his eyes. "What in God's name are you doing, boy?" Elias paused, leaning on his shovel. He wiped a sleeve across his forehead, leaving a muddy streak. "Building a home." Abernathy snorted, a dry, crackling sound. "A home? You're digging your own grave is what you're doing. A hole in the north face of a hill? Have you lost your senses entirely? Wait until the first autumn rain. You'll be living in a mud puddle. Wait until winter. The frost will heave these walls right in on you." He shook his head, a gesture of pity more than anger. "Your father was a good man, Elias. He knew how to build a proper house, out in the sun, on a stone foundation." "I have a plan," Elias said quietly, his voice not rising to the challenge. It was a simple statement of fact. "A plan to freeze to death?" Abernathy gathered his reins. "Don't come to me when you're sick with lung fever. There's a limit to neighborly charity." He rode off without a backward glance, the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the steady rhythm of Elias's digging. Boro whined softly, looking from the retreating figure back to Elias. Elias reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. The fur was thick and warm. The plan was not his own, not entirely. After the sickness had taken his mother, then his father, then his grandfather in the space of a single brutal winter, Elias had been left with the silent house and his grandfather's possessions. Among them was a leather-bound journal, filled with his grandfather's elegant script and precise technical drawings. His grandfather had been an engineer in the old country, a man of quiet theories and unconventional ideas that found little purchase in the practical world of Prospects Fall. The journal was filled with sketches of structures built into the earth. Pages were dedicated to the principles of thermal mass, the way the ground itself could store the sun's warmth and bleed it back slowly, moderating the killing cold of winter and the oppressive heat of summer. There were calculations for roof loads to bear the weight of snow, 10 feet deep or more. There were designs for ventilation shafts that would pull fresh air through the dwelling without creating drafts, and a special, baffling design for a chimney that would prevent wind from blowing smoke back into the house. It was a blueprint for survival, written by a man who had seen too many hard winters. Elias read it not as theory, but as a last will and testament. His second visitor was Mr. Sterling, who owned the lumber mill and, by extension, half the town. He arrived in a carriage, flanked by 2 men whose suits were as black as his own. Sterling was a man who saw the world in board feet and dollar signs. He looked at the excavation, then at Elias, his lip curling in amusement. "Abernathy told me you'd taken leave of your wits, Thorne, but I had to see it for myself," Sterling said, his voice booming with forced bonhomie. "That's the craziest thing I've ever seen. What is this, a root cellar? Planning to live with the potatoes?" His men chuckled on cue. Elias straightened up. His hands were raw, the blisters from the first day already torn open. "It'll be warm in winter." Sterling laughed outright. "Warm? It'll be a tomb of ice. Son, I'll sell you the lumber to build a proper cabin, on credit, for your father's sake. Don't do this. People are talking. They think the grief has undone you." "This is my home," Elias stated, turning back to his work. He drove the spade into the earth. The sound was a full stop. Sterling watched him for another moment, the smile fading from his face. He saw no argument, no plea, just the steady, relentless motion of the boy and the shovel. It was unsettling. "Have it your way," he muttered, signaling his driver. The carriage rattled away, leaving only the scent of horse and leather and money. Elias worked until dusk, his shadow stretching long behind him. He had excavated a rectangular pit, 30 feet wide and 40 feet deep, into the slope. The back wall was the hill itself, a solid face of earth and rock. He sat on the edge of the pit, sharing a piece of dried bread with Boro, as the valley below filled with purple shadows. The lights of the town began to flicker on, one by one, small points of warmth against the encroaching night. They looked terribly far away. The next phase was the foundation. The journal specified a footing of immense flat stones laid below the frost line. The nearest source was the creek bed a half-mile away. For 2 weeks, Elias's world shrank to the path between the creek and the hill. He used a wooden sledge and Boro's willing, if limited, pulling power to haul the stones. Each one was a monument to gravity. He would spend an hour wrestling a single 300-pound slab of granite onto the sledge, his muscles screaming, his joints on fire. The journey back up the slight incline was a slow-motion agony. He learned to use levers and rollers, to read the grain of the rock, to understand the physics of mass and inertia. He bled, he sweated, he endured. Mrs. Gable, whose house bordered the path to the creek, would watch him from her kitchen window, her expression a mixture of pity and concern. One afternoon, she brought him a glass of buttermilk. "Elias, dear," she said, her hands twisting in her apron, "this isn't healthy. You're working yourself to bone. There are folks in town who would help you put up a frame. You only have to ask." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," he said, downing the buttermilk in 3 long swallows. It was cold and sharp and wonderful. "I have a system." "But a house of dirt? It's not right. It's not clean." He handed her back the empty glass. "It will be." He laid the foundation stones in a trench 4 feet deep, fitting them together like a puzzle. On this, he began to build the walls. He couldn't afford Mr. Sterling's lumber and wouldn't have used it for the main structure anyway. The journal was clear. The walls needed mass. He used the stones he'd cleared from the excavation, mortaring them together with a mixture of clay from the creek bank, sand, and lime he'd bought with the last of his father's money. The work was slower than digging, more precise. Each stone had to be fitted, leveled, and set. The walls rose by inches each day. Buro would lie on a patch of sun-warmed grass, his head on his paws, a silent, furry foreman. Summer arrived, hot and heavy. The valley floor baked. People complained of the heat, the dust, the flies. In Elias's excavation, it was cooler. The earth walls bled a gentle chill into the air. He worked shirtless, his back and shoulders turning a deep brown, his muscles cording and hardening until he looked less like a boy and more like a part of the landscape he was shaping. It was during this time that Lena Abernathy started visiting. She was her father's daughter in her directness, but she lacked his cynicism. She brought water, not buttermilk, and questions, not warnings. "Is that the back wall?" she asked, pointing to the sheer face of earth at the rear of the structure. "Yes, the earth is the wall." "Won't it be damp?" "I'm building an inner wall with a gap for air. The journal calls it a capillary break." He tapped a drawing he'd tacked to a temporary post. She studied the drawing, her brow furrowed in concentration. She didn't mock it. She traced the lines with her finger. "And the roof? How can a roof hold up a whole hill?" "Beams," he said, "big ones." He spent the hottest month of summer in the woods on the far side of the valley, felling 10 massive pine trees. He chose them with the same care he'd chosen the stones, measuring their diameter, checking for rot or weakness. The crash of each tree falling was a profound, earth-shaking event in the quiet woods. Getting the logs to his building site was the greatest challenge yet. He bartered his grandfather's old pocket watch for the use of a farmer's ox and cart for a week. The ox was old and stubborn, and the work was brutal. But by the end of August, 10 enormous logs, each 2 feet in diameter, lay beside his stone walls. Hoisting them into place was a task that seemed impossible for one man. He used a system of levers, ramps, and a block and tackle he'd rigged to a sturdy oak tree growing above the site. It took him a full day for each beam. He would strain, the ropes groaning, the wood creaking, his body a single taut muscle, until the massive log would slowly, grudgingly, lift and settle into the notches he'd cut in the top of the stone walls. When the last beam was in place, he collapsed onto the ground, too tired to move, and watched the stars appear in the rectangle of sky framed by his roof timbers. Borrow licked his face, a gesture of quiet celebration. Across the valley, Mr. Abernathy watched the beams go up. He said nothing to Elias, but he spoke to his wife. "The boy has more grit than sense, I'll give him that. But when the snow comes, those beams will snap like twigs." With the main beams in place, Elias laid a deck of thick, hand-hewn planks. This was the base of the roof. Over this, he layered materials as his grandfather's journal instructed. First, a thick coating of pine tar he rendered himself, a sticky, stinking job that left him blackened from head to foot. The smell clung to him for weeks. Next came a layer of heavy, oil-soaked canvas. Then a foot of dense, waterproof clay, dug from a seam down by the river and hauled up bucket by painstaking bucket. He packed it down until it was as hard as stone. Finally, he began the last step, cutting thick squares of sod from the meadow above and laying them over the clay, grass side up. As he laid the final piece of sod, Lena appeared, carrying a basket. "My father said to tell you he's slaughtering a hog tomorrow, if you want to share." It was the closest the old man had come to an olive branch. "I'll be there," Elias said. He looked at his work. The house had disappeared. From the sides and the top, it was just a gentle, grass-covered mound, an extension of the hill itself. Only the front, the south-facing wall, remained open to the world. It was a facade of exposed timber framing, waiting for windows and a door. "It's gone," Lena said, her voice full of wonder. "It's there," Elias corrected gently. "It's just listening to the earth." The interior work consumed the autumn. He built the fireplace first, a massive hearth of river stone capable of taking 4-foot logs. The flue was the most complex part. a winding channel of brick and mortar designed to maximize heat exchange before the smoke exited. He built furniture from the leftover timber, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a bed frame. He installed the windows, 3 large panes of glass that cost him nearly everything he'd earned from selling the small herd of goats his father had left him. They faced due south, a passive eye to catch the low winter sun. His final, all-consuming task was firewood. He knew the town's conventional wisdom, a cord of wood per room to last the winter. His grandfather's journal scoffed at this. "Their houses leak heat like sieves," he had written. "A well-built earth home needs but a fraction. But prepare for the worst winter, not the average one. Prepare for the winter that breaks the world." Elias prepared. He spent every daylight hour of October and early November cutting and splitting wood. He didn't just gather a winter's supply, he gathered a siege's supply. He stacked it against the western exterior wall of the house, where the wind was weakest. The wall of wood grew to be 10 feet high and 30 feet long, a fortress of fuel. The townspeople saw the woodpile, and it became a new source of mockery. "Look at Thorne's woodpile," Mr. Sterling announced to his cronies at the general store. "He's got enough wood to heat the whole valley. Thinks he's going to hibernate like a bear in his cave." The first snows came in late November, a gentle dusting that prettified the landscape. The town settled into its winter rhythm. Smoke curled from every chimney. The days grew short. Elias and Boros spent their time inside. The house was finished. A small, steady fire in the hearth kept the single large room at a constant, comfortable temperature. The air was still and quiet. The loudest sound was the crackle of the fire or the thump of Boros' tail against the wooden floor. The thick earth walls and sod roof insulated them from the world. When the wind howled outside, it was only a distant, muffled hum inside. The temperature in the house barely fluctuated, holding steady around 60 degrees even when the fire burned down to embers overnight. The stones of the hearth and the earth itself held the warmth. It worked. In the second week of December, the sky turned a strange, milky gray. The air grew unnaturally still and heavy. The temperature plummeted. Mr. Abernathy, leading his milk cow back to the barn, saw Elias on his roof, clearing the snow from his chimney and ventilation shafts. "A big one's coming, boy," Abernathy called out, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Can feel it in my bones. That first nor'easter will be a killer. Hope your hole doesn't flood when the melt comes." "It'll be fine," Elias called back. It began not with a fury, but with a whisper. Fine, hard crystals of snow, more like sand than fluff, began to drift down. The wind picked up, not a gale, but a steady, relentless river of air pouring down from the Arctic. Within hours, the whisper became a hiss. By nightfall, the hiss had become a roar. The world outside the windows dissolved into a churning vortex of white. Inside, Elias added another log to the fire. He sat at his table, mending a piece of harness leather. Boros slept by the hearth, twitching in a dream, his paws paddling. The storm was an abstraction, a story told by the muffled roar that was the only hint of the chaos outside. The glass of the south-facing windows rattled slightly in the worst gusts, but the thick timber frame held firm. The temperature inside remained a placid 62 degrees. He felt the deep, resonant peace of a man who had prepared for the apocalypse and found his shelter equal to the task. He slept soundly. He woke the next morning to a world of twilight. The windows were completely covered by snowdrifts. The only light came from the fire and a faint, ethereal glow filtering through the snowpack. The roar of the wind was even louder, a constant, high-pitched shriek. He went about his day. He ate breakfast. He carved a small wooden bird. He read his grandfather's journal. Boro chewed on a bone. It was a day like any other, lived at the bottom of a white ocean. The second day was the same, and the third. On the afternoon of the third day, a new sound broke the monotony. A frantic, desperate pounding on his door. Boro shot up, barking. Elias quieted him with a hand signal and unbarred the heavy plank door. A figure, caked in snow and ice, stumbled inside and collapsed on the floor. It was Mr. Abernathy. His face was a mask of blue-white frostbite, his clothes frozen stiff. Elias dragged him toward the fire, pulling off his frozen coat and boots. "The roof," Abernathy stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "The weight of the snow, it just cracked. The whole north side of the house came down." He looked around the calm, warm room, his eyes wide with a dawning, shattering realization. The air didn't sting. The wind didn't howl. There was only the gentle heat of the fire and the quiet solidity of the walls. It worked," he whispered, the words a surrender. "My God, boy, it worked." Elias said nothing. He fetched a bowl of snow and began to gently, carefully, rub Abernathy's frozen cheeks and hands, bringing the feeling back with an agony that made the old man weep. He wrapped him in blankets and gave him a hot broth. The old skeptic, the voice of conventional wisdom, huddled by the fire in the dirt house he had mocked, saved from the storm that had destroyed his own proper home. Later that evening, another knock came. This time it was Mrs. Gable and her two small children, their faces pinched with cold and fear. "The windows blew in, Elias," she cried, her voice breaking. "The wind, it just took them. We have nowhere to go." "Come in," Elias said, standing aside to let them pass. The children stared, wide-eyed, at the huge fireplace, their shivering slowly subsiding in the radiant heat. By the fourth day, Elias's home had become a sanctuary. The Gables and Abernathy were joined by the Millers, a young couple whose chimney had collapsed, filling their small house with suffocating smoke. They brought stories from the town. No one could get through. The snow was 15 feet deep in the streets. The drifts were piled up to the second story of most buildings. The town was paralyzed, frozen, buried. Sterling's grand house, with its modern furnace, had been the first to fail. A servant had told Abernathy before the storm hit its peak that the fuel line had frozen solid. The grandest house in Prospects Fall was now as cold as a tomb. On the fifth day, the wind finally began to subside. The roar lessened to a moan, then a sigh, then silence. The silence was more profound than the noise had been. The next morning, Elias had to tunnel his way out. He dug a steep trench up from his door through 15 feet of densely packed snow. When he broke through to the surface, the world was blinding. The sun was brilliant on a landscape of impossible sculptural white. The valley was gone, buried under a sea of snow. Only the tops of the tallest roofs and chimneys were visible, black specks in a universe of white. His own home was just a smooth, snow-covered mound, indistinguishable from the rest of the hill, with a single tunnel entrance and a plume of gray smoke rising bravely from its hidden chimney. Abernathy followed him out. He stood, leaning on Elias's shoulder, and surveyed the ruin of his farm. His barn was a splintered wreck. His house was a gaping wound. He looked at the devastation, then back at the simple mound of snow that was Elias's home. He didn't say anything. He just squeezed Elias's shoulder, a gesture of profound, wordless apology. In the days that followed, the survivors of Prospects Fall dug themselves out. The toll was heavy. Several of the outlying homes were completely destroyed. Mr. Sterling's mansion was a wreck of burst pipes and ruined furniture. The town's supply of firewood, stored in open-sided sheds, was buried under impenetrable drifts. But the people who had sheltered with Elias were safe. The story spread. They came to him then, not with mockery, but with a quiet, humbled curiosity. They gathered at the entrance to his home, their faces grim in the cold winter light. Mr. Sterling was there, his fine coat replaced by a patched work jacket, his arrogance replaced by a weary exhaustion. "We were wrong, Thorne," Sterling said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual boom. "You tried to tell us. We wouldn't listen." He gestured at the frozen town. "This can't happen again. We need to rebuild, the right way." He looked at Elias, a question in his eyes. "How did you know?" Elias didn't answer directly. He went inside and returned with his grandfather's journal. He opened it on the sturdy table he had built, its pages filled with the elegant script and the precise drawings that had guided his hands. "It's all in here," he said. They crowded around, peering at the designs, the calculations, the notes on thermal mass and wind baffling. Abernathy, his hands still bandaged, traced a drawing of the roof structure with a trembling finger. "All that time," he murmured, "the knowledge was right here." That spring, the rebuilding began. It did not resemble the town that had been. The first new house was Abernathy's, built into the slope behind the ruins of his old one. Elias did not supervise, but his journal was passed from hand to hand, its pages becoming smudged with the dirt and sweat of honest labor. Sterling, using his resources for the common good for the first time, brought in stonemasons and supplied timber not for profit, but for survival. They built into the hillsides, turning their backs to the wind, opening their faces to the sun. They learned to respect the earth, not to fight it. The town of Prospects Fall slowly transformed. The fragile grid on the valley floor was gradually abandoned in favor of the sturdy, semi-subterranean homes nestled into the landscape. By the 5th year, a dozen such homes dotted the hillsides, their sod roofs greening in the summer, their south-facing windows glittering in the low winter sun. The town had learned its lesson, paid for in wood and stone and frozen pipes. Elias married Lena Abernathy 2 summers after the Great Blizzard. They were married on the green roof of his home, the whole town in attendance. Their life was quiet and full. They raised 2 children in the house of earth and stone, children who grew up understanding that true strength was not in defiance of nature, but in harmony with it. Elias never sought a position of leadership. He didn't need to. He was the keeper of the knowledge, the quiet man who had listened to the earth when no one else would. Years passed. The seasons turned. The Great Blizzard became a legend, told to wide-eyed children. A story of a town that nearly died and a quiet boy who saved it. Boro grew old. His muzzle turned gray. His steps became slow and deliberate. He spent his days sleeping by the great hearth, his favorite spot in all the world. One autumn evening, he lay his head on Elias's lap, gave a soft sigh, and his gentle heart stopped beating. Elias carried his old friend, his first and most faithful believer, up the hill and buried him in a spot overlooking the transformed town, marking the grave with a simple, flat stone. Elias himself grew old. His hair turned the color of winter snow. His hands, once hard and calloused, became knotted with arthritis, but they were still skilled. He taught his grandchildren how to read the weather in the sky and the plans in his grandfather's journal, which he had rebound in new leather. He saw the town thrive, its people secure in homes that were extensions of the land itself. He died in his 87th year, in the bed he had built, with Lena's hand in his. He died in the quiet, warm house that had been his life's work, the sound of a gentle spring rain tapping on the earth above him. They buried him on the hill beside Boro, under the shade of a pine tree that had grown from a seed that had fallen long ago. The townspeople, The children and grandchildren of the skeptics and the saved erected a marker not of wood, but of granite hauled from the same creek bed where he had once hauled his foundation stones. Lena herself chose the words. They were simple and true, carved deep into the stone for all the ages to see. Elias Thorne. He listened to the earth. It gave us a home. From the gravesite, one could see the entire valley. The old, abandoned grid on the valley floor had been reclaimed by meadowgrass and wildflowers. The life of the town was now in the hills, in the warm, solid homes that dotted the slopes, their chimneys sending up thin plumes of smoke into the clear mountain air. And at the center of it all, a gentle, grass-covered mound stood, its south-facing windows still catching the sun. The house he built, the promise he had kept, had become a permanent part of the landscape, a silent, enduring monument to quiet persistence and the wisdom of listening.